Over the years, I've learned many insights and nuanced layers to the stories of the Bible that have impacted my thinking. I'm very thankful because I believe that the things that I have learned have enriched my understanding of Scripture and have therefore enriched my life overall. Now, it's my longing to teach others to understand their Bibles. I really do want believers to understand the Bible and the incredibly rich message it's trying to convey. Yes, it's a beautiful message of personal salvation, forgiveness of sins, restoration unto inner peace with the Creator, and the promise of a bright future hope and glory with the Creator, exalted be He. But it's also so much more than that. Allow me to share with you just one single verse from the Bible. And let's see together if we can find within it a deeper level of meaning. I hope this insight impacts your life to the degree that it impacted mine when I first learned it. Genesis chapter 3, verse 15 reads this way in the King James Version of the Bible. I will put enmity between thee and the woman, and between thy seed and her seed. It shall bruise thy head, and thou shalt bruise his heel. There are those that believe that the story of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden to be the oldest story in human history. There are also those who simply can't accept this story as more than just a myth from some ancient primitive culture to explain the origin of man. But others see it as a literal happening in the beginning of man's existence and his troubles in this earth. Whichever view you hold, it seems to be a very tragic story with an altogether unhappy ending. Because in this narrative, man, who begins with such supreme potential and unlimited fellowship with his Creator God, ultimately succumbs to the temptings of a deceptive character known as the Nahash, which usually gets translated as serpent or snake. And as a result of this failure begins to experience the heartache and of judgment and alienation from the Creator. With this introduction of evil into the human race, the consequences of rebellion, guilt, self-will, selfishness, and death begin to manifest themselves within Adam and his seed line. But the Creator, exalted be He, promises a solution. Well, let's talk about this. Shalom, brothers and sisters in Messiah. Rafi Sweeney here with Apostolic Nazarene Israel, and pastor of Apostolic Nazarene Bible Assembly in Orlando, Florida, a Messianic Israelite congregation. Today, I would like to talk about the Messianic seed promise. That there's evil in the world is obvious. It's a fact of reality that none of us can deny. Philosophers have called it the problem of evil. Evil is everywhere, in every culture, infiltrating every single aspect of human existence. This world seems to be completely immersed in evil at every corner. It's also true that the world is simply the sum total of all the individuals in it, each with his or her own attitudes of self-centeredness, intolerance, and rebellion. Thus, the distresses, the afflictions, the anxieties which ail this world are simply an amplification of those which ail each one of us as individuals. So the waywardness of the world seems to be the byproduct of the waywardness of every individual within it. This wayward tendency in mankind is so self-evident that some explanation for its origin must be found. If we are to believe the consistent biblical record, then we must accept the fact that the Nahash's beguiling temptings of Adam and Eve, enticing them to disregard God's expressed will, led them into an act and attitude of rebellion against God, which is the heart of what the Bible thereafter describes as sin. Theologians argue about whether man's disposition to sin is something which was introduced as a taint in all flesh from Adam's day on, or whether man simply gets around to sinning because he catches it like a disease from those around him. This isn't a moot question, because sin is far too prevalent in the world for us to say that it's found in greater degrees in some societies and cultures than in others. If all men were born good or even morally neutral, you'd expect to find some places in the world where sin, by any reasonable standard of measurement, has no great foothold. But this isn't the case. We find sin everywhere throughout human culture. The Bible, Old and New Testaments, does not hide the fact that souls are brought into this world with a certain weakness that cannot be overcome by mere strength of will. All are born with predilection to rebel against the Creator, exalted be He, and this predilection, this weakness, will eventually bring them to a place of expression of that rebellion in some act of failing to do the Creator's will or doing something against His will, both of which are considered to be called sin by all the writers of the Bible. When we reserve the right to determine what is good by our own human judgment of reason, the result will always be pain, suffering, and injustice, because the human heart is warped away from seeking the purest good of others and is bent on seeking individual personal good. This perpetuates the problem of evil within the human picture. Therefore, we are all a part of the ubiquitous problem of evil. Each and every one of us, at some point in our life, have made a major contribution to the collective problem of evil in this world. This is precisely why the humanist ideal can never be achieved. Philosophers talk about the problem of evil, but the problem of evil is not merely a philosophical idea. It's something real, and is at the core of your heart from birth, and it is at the core of my heart from birth. You and I, left to our natural human proclivities, are the perpetrators of the problem of evil in this world. We are personally responsible for that, not the Creator. Rather, it is the natural human condition that is the problem, because the natural human condition is divorced from the source. We so often picture evil as out there instead of inside our own hearts. We blame the world's evil on everyone else. We may not fully realize it, but what we're really saying within ourselves is the world is evil because everyone else only thinks for themselves. If only everyone listened to me, we would have no evil in this world. This is really the underlying philosophy that most people hold, whether they realize it or not. We may think that we ourselves hold the answers to what ails the world. But even when we think this way, we do not realize that we too are the reason for the problem of evil in this world. The freedom and ability to say no to God is actually the reason for the problem of evil in this world, and therefore the reason for this fallen world. But I would add, in addition to that statement, I would say this, that the freedom and ability to say no to God is in fact the reason for the fallen cosmos, including all natural disasters and diseases. It's a byproduct of a free will at work in opposition to the Creator. Free will is also the reason for the suffering and injustice carried out by individuals. Wars, exploitation, violent crime, human tragedies, genocides, self-centered ambition, greed, and the like. All of this is a byproduct of people using free will to act outside of the Creator's will. I'd like for you to get that point. Human evil is the inevitable result of humans exercising personal autonomous will without submitting that will to the higher will of the Creator of all things. Imagine, if you would, that the universe came with a manual of operation, but no one could read it because either we are so ignorant that we can't read, or we're so stubborn and self-willed that we won't read. Our ignorance of the way things really are, together with our rebellious tendency to do what is right, function as the barriers that keep us from knowing how to properly thrive within a universe put together by a wise and loving Creator. This is the underlying message of the Genesis story. Now, the Genesis story is a story that I believe really happened. It is a record of sorts in that it faithfully tells us the gist of some event that took place on this earth millennia ago. But I'm not necessarily making a plea that every word of the story is given to us in completely literal expressions. I agree that Genesis 1 through 3 makes heavy use of evasive metaphors and Hebrew idioms. Don't misunderstand me, however. By saying that, I'm not saying that I think that Genesis 1 through 3 is itself metaphorical in nature. I personally believe that all of the book of Genesis is factually true as history. I believe that the Garden of Eden was an actual real place and that Adam and Eve were actual real people. I believe in the expulsion. I believe in the Great Flood and that it was an actual real catastrophic event with a real ark that I believe still exists somewhere in Turkey as an actual artifact to be discovered. However, some details of the Genesis story are too graphic to state plainly, and so I also believe that the Spirit has inspired certain use of language to speak of particular events in a way that is more appropriate for the situation. I don't believe, however, that Genesis 1 through 3 is intended to be a scientific explanation of the way things were or the way they became. And I think that we can find lots of metaphorical type language within the text. I don't have a problem with that, and I don't think that that necessarily has to detract from seeing Genesis as a real account to be taken seriously. There's a lot of sexual focus going on in Genesis chapter 1 through 3. And so we find a lot of evasive metaphor type language being employed within the narrative that ancient readers would have understood. But often people today, they just simply don't understand. But the events that Genesis 1 through 3 speaks of really happened. There really was a garden. There really were two people, an Adam and an Eve, or more factually, an Adam and an Isha, whose name was later changed to Eve. And there really was a talking Nahash that approached Isha, Eve, and convinced her to participate in a covenant meal involving the very fruit of a tree that the Creator commanded them not to eat from. The Nahash was not a snake. He was a divine being that was part of a cosmic-wide rebellion against the Creator. I believe that the Nahash was a seraph, a fallen one at that. He was a devil. When the Nahash sought to persuade Adam and Eve to disobey the Creator by eating the forbidden fruit, he was really seeking to get Adam and Eve to join in the cosmic-wide rebellion by doing an act that was counter to the Creator's will. But in so doing, Adam and Eve lost their fellowship and communion with the Creator. They no longer had uninhibited access into their loving Creator's presence. In fact, a barrier was erected between them and Yahuah, a barrier so real that no one but the Creator himself could remove it and reestablish a relationship with man. This is where the promise of Genesis 3:15 comes in. In this diatribe which Elohim had with the Nahash after Adam's fall, Yahuah, blessed be his name, put a curse on him and pronounced that a time would come when a future descendant of Eve, called the seed of the woman, would restore restore Adam back to his position and destroy the Nahash and his work like a man grinding a snake head under his foot. This seed of the woman would give the Nahash a fatal blow, but in return, it was said that the Nahash would damage him, as if he were bruised on the heel. That is, a painful blow, but not necessarily a permanently fatal one, such as a blow on the head would be. By itself, Genesis 3:15 does not seem to make a lot of sense. The words can be understood, but what is the statement intended to refer to? This passage is therefore considered cryptic. People have puzzled over the nature of this passage for centuries. The author of the verse knew and understood what he was trying to get across, so it's not a random or arbitrary statement. It definitely seems to be deliberate and has a centrally important point to make, but exactly what that point is has been highly debatable. Centuries ago, Jewish rabbis and early Christians determined that this passage had to be a prophecy. Thus, Genesis 3:15 is ostensibly the first prophecy in the Bible. Christian scholars call this verse the protevangelium, meaning the first gospel, because it is the first direct proclamation of the evangel, or the gospel, of a coming Savior, which here is called the seed of the woman, seen as a prophecy of the coming King Messiah and the ultimate victory over all evil. So Genesis 3:15 is the first messianic prophecy found in the Bible. It is the first occurrence of any proclamation of a promise of a Redeemer for humankind from the Creator, exalted be He. It's just a glimpse, but nevertheless, it sets the stage for the coming of a Redeemer to rectify the consequences of Adam's sin. The word seed, as used here in this passage, is the word zerah in Hebrew. It has to do with progeny, with posterity, referring to descendants, what we call in English offspring. Commentators tell us that the word represents a collective singular and has a meaning of group more than individual. However, this may include the one who represents the whole group as well as the whole group itself. So the seed is described as being of the woman and is distinct from the woman. What's more, the seed is of the woman and not the father. That is highly unusual. At the same time, the word heel is masculine singular, which cannot refer to the woman, which is feminine, or the serpent, which is the object of the attack. This is an intriguing prophecy. The phrase, her seed, is an unusual description. Normally people spoke of the seed of the man or of the father, but not of the seed of the woman. In the ancient Near East, where the Bible was written, descendants were always regarded as the sons or daughters of the father. Descent was reckoned from the father, reckoned patrilineally. For instance, all the genealogies of the Bible are traced through the fathers, not the mothers. That's different from what Jews do today. Jews today reckon their descent through their mother's lines. They reckon descent matrilineally, but not so in the Bible. Biblically, descent is always reckoned patrilineally through the father. But the phrase, her seed, then sounds very unusual. It's not the normal way to speak of descent. It is unique. It's not a descriptor of a natural, normal generation. In the case of this seed, the mother is the lineage, with no explanation offered. So it seemed we had a mystery here in the earliest story of humankind. There's been a lot said about this point of fact. It is recognized that even from ancient times, the Jews realized that the wording of this verse set up something unusual, something in the realm of the miraculous. The ancient rabbis realized that this was not a normal way to describe the generation and descent of a human being. So they concluded that this was a prophecy of a unique birth. The ancient rabbis then ascribed this passage to the promise of a Goel, a Redeemer, later also given the title King Messiah. We can see evidence that the ancient rabbis interpreted Genesis 3:15 to be a cryptic reference to a Messiah, because even in the Targums, the ancient paraphrased translations of the Old Testament into Aramaic, this passage was paraphrased to bear a reference to the Messiah. In Targum Jonathan, in its paraphrase of this verse, we find that the rabbis of that period connected this verse to the coming of a king Messiah. We read, quote, "And I will put enmity between thee and the woman, and between the seed or offspring of thy children and the seed or offspring of her children. And it shall be, when the children of the woman keep the commandments of the law, they will be prepared to smite thee upon thy head. But when they forsake the commandments of the law, thou wilt be ready to wound them in their heel. For them, however, there shall be a remedy, but for thee there shall be no remedy. And they shall make peace in the end, in the days of the King Messiah." That's the quote from the Targum Jonathan on Genesis chapter 3, verse 15. So, this was understood as bearing a prophetic and messianic significance even among the Jews in ancient times. There's a clear recognition of a messianic connection in this verse, and connected to the idea of a future remedy for the people who had forsaken the commandments of the law, a remedy for those who sinned. Even the ancient Jewish rabbis recognized this connection. In the same way, God's promised one, the Messiah, was to be the offspring of a woman in some unique way, a unique conception. Somehow, a miraculous conception in the womb of a woman. The passage simply states that there will come the seed of the woman, with no explanation as to how that kind of thing is possible. At least, it's never explained until Isaiah chapter 7, verse 14. I'll spoil the plot for you here. What we have in this verse, Genesis 3:15, the famous Protevangelium, is a hint of the virgin conception, an offspring of a woman without the contribution of the seed of a man, Yeshua, who became conceived in the womb of a virgin named Miriam. Yeshua of Nazareth, he is the seed of the woman, the fulfillment of the messianic seed prophecy called the Protevangelium. Yeshua is the seed that represents the collective whole of the human race that descended from that first Adam. We find that the Protevangelium of Genesis 3:15 was well known among the early Christians and was spoken of by the early church fathers and by early Syrian Orthodox fathers. The early church fathers recorded that the Protevangelium foretold the coming of a Redeemer, whom Christians recognized to be Jesus the Christ, born of Mary, the new Eve, who came to crush the serpent's head, symbolizing the triumph over evil and death. The early church fathers interpreted Genesis 3:15 as a prophecy of Jesus, Yeshua, who would come through the woman, Mary, to defeat the serpent, Satan, and destroy Satan's works. Justin Martyr, for example, explicitly linked Genesis 3:15 with the coming of Jesus, Yeshua, born of the Virgin Mary, who would destroy the serpent and those who follow him. Irenaeus likewise emphasized the enmity between the serpent and the seed of the woman, fulfilled by the coming of the Messiah, who recapitulated the ancient enmity against the serpent. This messianic interpretation of Genesis 3:15 is rooted also in the broader Syriac Christian understanding of the Bible. Syriac church fathers like Ephraim the Syrian and Jacob of Sarug contributed to a rich tradition of interpreting the passage in a way that emphasized the significance of Yeshua the Messiah as the ultimate offspring of Eve, interpreting this verse in the context of the incarnation of the Son of Elohim. Later, Narcea of Nisibis, a prominent theologian and poet in Syriac Christianity, interpreted the seed of the woman as not just humanity in general, but specifically as a prophecy about the coming Messiah, Yeshua of Nazareth. He and other Syriac Christian fathers viewed this phrase, which refers to Eve's offspring, as a foreshadowing of the Messiah, who would overcome the serpent, Satan, and have victory. Narcea's writings, particularly his theological hymns known as Memra, provide insights into how Syriac Christians understood this key biblical verse. The messianic seed of the woman is attacked by the serpent and his seed and dealt a blow. But in the end, it is the messianic seed that wins the victory, as the seed in Messiah takes back all authority and dominion and triumphs over death and the grave. Ultimately, the seed of the woman crushes the head of the Nahash, signifying mortal defeat, not mere wounding. So it has come down through the centuries within Christian theological belief that Genesis 3:15, the so-called Messianic Protevangelium, or the Messianic seed promise, is a prophecy in the Bible, the very first prophecy, in fact, of the coming of a Redeemer Messiah figure, a Savior who would be born not of the seed of man, but born of a virgin woman, who would overcome the problem of evil by facing human suffering, misery, injustice, and death, himself experiencing the sting of death, but overcoming that death, thus defeating the serpent's seed and securing victory for all who trust in him. The seed of the woman has defeated evil and overcome suffering and death by having defeated the serpent and his seed, and now offers that victory to all those who place their trust in him. If you hate evil and the suffering that evil produces, you have but to submit to the Messiah Yeshua, the seed of the woman, who is victorious over evil, suffering, and death. Surrender your life over to him, abandon self-rule, and allow Yeshua, the Lion of Judah, to be your Lord and King. Through Messiah, Yeshua, the Lord is changing hearts and lives. He is conquering evil in our hearts, one heart at a time. The fact is, the Lord is currently dealing with the problem of evil, and when the fullness of time comes, it will be done. 2,000 years ago, the Word of Elohim stepped down out of the heavens, and he wrapped himself in flesh and blood, and he walked upon this earth for 33 years, and his name was Yeshua. He was the one to whom the ancient prophecy pointed, the one that the Messianic Protevangelium was referring to. Yeshua was the promised seed, the Goel Redeemer. What's more, Yeshua was the one that the patriarchs had been looking for. The Creator appeared to Abraham and to Isaac and to Jacob, and he said to them, "One day to your seed there shall come a great blessing." The blessed seed came as Yeshua, proclaiming the kingdom of heaven is at hand. But they refused to hear him. Instead of listening to him, they crucified him. They drove nails into his hands and through the heels of his feet as they nailed him to the wood of a Roman execution stake, a cross, called a tzaliba. Yeshua stretched out his arms on a cross and said, "It is finished." Experiencing untold agony and suffering there on that cross, Yeshua breathed his last and he died. But the work that the Father sent him to earth to do was finished. They buried him in a tomb and they left him there for dead. But 3 days later, that same Yeshua came back to life and came out of that tomb. Although he was dead, he overcame death and triumphed over it. And he is still alive today. And he will come back. He is not dead. He's alive. Through his resurrection, Yeshua defeated the devil, that old serpent. And now Yeshua is the victor. And now, you can have forgiveness, pardon, and acceptance today. You can know that you made the greatest exchange in the world, to exchange your sin for his forgiveness, to exchange your turmoil and your pain for his peace and his comfort, to exchange your sickness for his healing, your lack for his abundance. Would you like to have this? You can. The invitation is made to you. With that, I'll close this video, and I hope you benefited from this teaching. May he grant you the spirit of wisdom and revelation in the knowledge of him, so that the eyes of your understanding may be enlightened, and so that you may know what is the hope of his calling, and what is the riches of the glory of his inheritance in the saints, and what is the exceeding greatness of his power toward them who believe, according to the working of his mighty power which he wrought in Messiah when he raised him from the dead, and set him at his own right hand in the heavenly places. May Yahuah richly bless you and be with you, and with all those you love. In the precious name of our wonderful Messiah, Yeshua, Shalom.